So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this CoDE event, celebration the publication of Suriyah Bi's latest book. Can everyone online hear me? Can someone wave at Bridget or something just to see?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay, great, lovely. Thank you so much. So thank you to everyone who joined us online and in person. I realise this is probably a busy time of year for people, so thank you for taking time out from marking or possibly revising or whatever it is that people are doing. It's particularly on such a beautiful sunny day, in Manchester at least. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Suriyah today. Suriyah is the senior lecturer in human geography at Cardiff University. Her work spans a range of different areas around migration, the politics of identity, race, religion, and racialization. So all things that are very dear to my heart. She has a particular focus on British Muslims and a particular focus which I would like her to say more about later, perhaps on linking her research to policy impact and her work focuses particularly on issues of masculinity, state power, and inequality. And today she's going to talk to us about her book, which came out in 2024 with Manchester University Press, titled Bartered, Bridegrooms, Transacting Muslim Masculinities as Colonial Legacy. I've written this down and I can't read my writing, so I'm sorry about that. So Suriyah's going to speak for about 30 minutes and then there'll be time for people to ask questions. I already have a bunch of questions I want to ask. So welcome and thank you. I'm going to pass you over to speak from the course and then great.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming along today. It's a really great honour for me to be here. Thank you to Brett and Alexander, Professor Byrne for being able to host this. It's always really great to collaborate, but also collaborate with scholars, senior scholars who have done so much to further our field of working, and certainly Professor Alexander's work was featured in the book, and certainly pioneering and work that I've built on. So this wouldn't have been possible, the book wouldn't have been possible without articulations and the hard work of many senior scholars, of which are, huge lighthouses here in Manchester, including Professor Byrne and Professor Alexander. So I just really wanted to pay tribute to them because it's not possible for younger scholars like us to come to the field if it wasn't for their hard work, for us to then, build on and develop. So thank you so much. As Professor Alexander mentioned, the book is called Bartered, Bridegrooms, Transacting Muslim Masculinity as Colonial Legacies. It was published in 2024 in December. So to provide an overview of what we'll talk about today, I'll be covering representations in academic and public discourse of Muslim masculinity, both historical and contemporary. Then provide a background to the ethnography that I conducted, after which I'll then speak on the intersecting geographic spaces, discuss some of the key findings that are highlighted in the book, particularly gender performativity. This looks at Judith Butler's work, Performing Gender. I'll talk a little bit about that, the book's position on Judith Butler's work. Rich Turner's work from anthropology, in particular, which focuses on liminality and the book's position towards this theory. So one of the arguments I'll make is that liminality can be an extended or a permanent state experienced by migrants, particularly migrant men in precarious situations, and citizenship as a performance of whiteness and white power, and how that can be an example of colonial legacies, as we're seeing in the case of migrant men, but research will need to be done or conducted to see whether this also stands for other case studies, perhaps. And then I'll talk about, on the final slide, a little bit about the further research and the directions I've been taking post the completion of this ethnography and the publication of the book, and where I see this area perhaps developing into. So to begin with, the political discourse, this is a clip, a screenshot of an article from earlier this year in January, about a month after the publication of the book. it is not a unknown or an alien sort of concept or rhetoric that's been thrown around within political narratives and political discourse. This is the narrative of grooming gangs, and the leader of the opposition, Kenny Badenoch, was referred to grooming gangs as being made up of peasants from sub-communities, which was really alarming because it spoke to Spivak's concept of subaltern. Can the subaltern speak? To use such language, such targeted, pointed language, that giants such as Spivak shaped our the interdisciplinary subjects was quite alarming for me, I think, using the term sub-communities. And I think this was perhaps taking the rhetoric even further down a narrow path. When this political discourse also perpetuates these stereotypes, despite the research which suggests otherwise, including the Home Office's research that suggests that sexual violence is not predominantly within the Pakistani community. And so there is a large use of mugshots that are perpetually portrayed in the media, and this compares quite strongly, quite starkly with the representation of Jimmy Savile, for example, who was portrayed in quite powerful positions on front pages when the scandal was unearthed after his death, and similarly of Prince Andrew and the allegations surrounding the scandal around him too. And so I think there's definitely the stereotypes of Muslim masculinity, of Asian masculinity, are certainly have not been, it's not been the first time that they've been around, but they are continuously sort of used as a capital to define communities, ethnic communities. I'm not going to say ethnic minorities because I strongly believe that I'm not a minority, or we're not minorities. And I think it's part of colonial legacies to perpetuate and internalize the language that subalternates us or subjugates us. So to say that we're a minority, I think we need to move away from that language because it perpetuates the majority-minority binary and places us outside the borders of the country. So that's why and I say this in the book, I don't like to use the term ethnic minority. I think communities is a more dignified way, I think, rather than that minority status. And these stereotypes that I'm referring to are not confined to the political space only. They're also in some academic discourse, although the discourse on masculinities and Muslim masculinities, affording or extending Canal's argument of multiple masculinities further, has been emerging and has done really well. I referred earlier to Professor Alexander's work, but there are still articles out there which refer to men or Muslim men as powerful patriarchs, perpetrators of domestic violence, forced marriage. Not that these do not happen. That is not what I'm arguing here. What I'm arguing is that there is a fundamental shift or a skewed direction or focus on one aspect of the literature that is still that is still part of reading lists, for example, that we need to decolonize. It's not only decolonizing from a global south or global north perspective, but also a variety of experiences, lived experiences within groups and cohorts that we're looking at. And so when we look at decolonization, we need to also look to turning structures, conventions, and perspectives, not only global south and global north, of which there are many forms, as I argue in the book as well. So the work sits on this body of literature that Canal, for example, Raymond Canal has talked about multiple masculinities, but I found this wasn't extended enough to Muslim communities, which was still very rigidly portrayed in the media, political discourse, and some aspects of academic discourse as well. However, there have been some efforts to diversify perspectives. So this is a great photo exhibition, and I'll share the slide, I have shared the slide with the centre.
I'll turn it back on. Keep going, keep going. Sorry if the sound was lost. Is this better now? Online? Okay.
So introducing with that backdrop, introducing the ethnography now. The project or the book, as you see it now, wasn't just the book as it is. It started out as my undergraduate dissertation, where I found 113 cases of domestic violence across 5 UK cities against migrant men from South Asia. And Manchester was one of those cities involved in that fieldwork. And for my PhD, I developed this work further, honed in on the city of Birmingham. I interviewed 62 migrant husbands, 43 community member interlocutors. Most interviews took place over the telephone due to anonymity and also protecting sort of gendered relations or perceptions of gendered relations between a male interlocutor and a female researcher, especially on taboo subjects. And so the city of Birmingham, I knew well, I was born and raised there, and so it was easy to access as well. So it was much more feasible research, at least in the way that I have encountered and accessed interlocutors. There were many intersecting geographic spaces. So as I sort of traced through the book doesn't just focus on Birmingham, and I think this is really important to highlight. The village, the town are really important in highlighting these spaces in which precarity, multiple masculinities and identities unfold, but also develop. There was also the barbershop, not only in the UK, but in villages in Pakistan and Kashmir. The kitchen, the dinner plate as a space, diet in terms of making the migrant husband in order to position and almost market himself as a desirable spouse or migrant spouse. Then the home and the household within the UK, within Pakistan and Kashmir was also a really significant space, as it was not the migrant journey as at which point the migrant spouse's experiences began, but actually his development and identity as a migrant spouse began sometimes many years before he began to be or stepped into the role of a migrant spouse, or before the wedding, for example, because the rishta process or the marriage process often, or the talks around the marriage process begin many years prior to the actual migration. And so migration studies, while it can often focus on point A and point B, or the journey between point A and B, actually what the book suggests is that we need to really zoom out of the actual journey, physical journey, and include in the migrant or migration experience the social migration, the social aspect that builds the physical migrant journey. So migration actually begins before the physical journey begins in that sense. There's also many religious spaces. The book includes and interweaves and traces such as Sufiscapes, a chapter where I map Sufiscapes in the city of Birmingham, which include mosques and gatherings. These are really important in identity making and resisting some of the more cultural pressures experienced by migrant men when they first come to Britain. And then there's the spaces of employment, where they also can experience precarity. Some migrant husbands, for example, experienced abuse in employment. One migrant husband interlocutor experienced third-degree burns, for example, but was in a grey area of employment, wasn't able to take his employer to court, for example, or wasn't able to have sort of sick pay because of the way in which grey area employment, the gig economy works as such. There's also digital spaces in which migrant husband identities are being forged. So, for example, WhatsApp, on YouTube, as I'll talk about shortly, where musical expression was key in furthering the migrant husband experience. And a quote here I've included from the book on page 36 is, my uncle, brothers and sister-in-law would put my picture as their display picture on WhatsApp, so that when family members in the UK would message them, they could see that I was a suitable match for their daughter. So it's how even on WhatsApp was an opportunity to market or to put forward, increase the prospects of migrant husbands prior to the migration journey began. So how social media was an integral part of that process. In terms of aspirations, emotions, and challenges, in one of the songs of sorrow that I came across from my interlocutors during interviews, for example, I found that there were images of simple foods that they perceived, such as lentils, working multiple jobs. For example, in this one musical Song of Sorrow, there was the portrayal of a migrant husband working in a butcher shop, in a supermarket, and then also coming home and cooking and cleaning and also washing dishes. So there were multiple spaces of employment, both outside of the home and inside of the home as well. And these really interrogated conventional gender roles and really stretch the idea, the topic, the concept of multiple masculinities further. We also have emotional representations within some of these songs of sorrow, which I've screenshotted, but also include in the book. Are images from the songs of sorrow and the videos that go with these representations of handing over the salary obtained from the employment to the wife, be left with a few pennies that could afford them 1 or 2 cigarettes from the shop, washing the dishes, but also a representation of abuse from the father-in-law in this representation on YouTube, that's available on YouTube, which we'll play shortly. And visibly being upset, my husband crying, actually, being shown to be crying, shedding tears in the kitchen, which is really unusual, an unusual representation. Something that we wouldn't see, a really stark contrast to what we're seeing in political rhetoric and representations of Muslim masculinity in particular. The book also discusses hones in on liminality as an extended or permanent state. As I mentioned prior, Victor Turner's work in anthropology is key to this, and the book is an interdisciplinary book. It hones in on and leans on multiple disciplines, particularly anthropology, sociology, and human geography. There's also Nicole Singerman and Ghassan Haj's work on waithood. We're seeing between this increased waiting period that migrants can experience. And some interlocutors I found had remained in Pakistan or some other parts of Pakistan and Kashmir for a decade after marriage because of the more sort of narrowing nature of UK immigration. So one interlocutor said, I got married in 2010, but I am still here in Pakistan 8 years later. My wife and 2 children are in the UK. I never thought I would be a father like this, with my children so far away, and I am stuck. This might be the way things are for a very long time. There is no point in submitting the case, as into the Home Office or to appeal, to say it is my human right to live with my family. They will just reject it. We are not going to waste almost £3,000 to file the case for the visa. And he went on to talk about how that money could be used to develop his children's futures, and that it could actually fund a couple more visits over the next 2 years, where he could regularly at least secure visits and time with his children, as opposed to invest it on insecure assets, such as, or things that may not even come to fruit, such as the immigration process and documentation that may or may not transpire from that. I also mentioned gender performativity throughout the book, and this builds on Judith Butler's work. But while I absolutely admire Butler's work and the contributions that it has made to disciplines, multiple disciplines, Butler argues that gender can be performed with a performance. But what I found is that in the case of Muslim men, we learned that their gender, their masculinity is performed on by multiple social and structural actors. For example, father-in-laws who wanted to control as many men in the wider king network for the maximum amount of honor, which is talked about by Farmer by Fisher from the 90s, but also by state actors and immigration laws. So on page 130, book reads, "Movement through migration impacts gender relations and gender performativity. I contend that gender is not performed as Butler 1990 puts it, as this denotes agency. Rather, gender, and I mean in this particular case, is performed on through power and control. Butler's concept of performativity is a remote dream for migrant husbands as they carve out spaces of resistance and agency to become closer to their desired position." So it's acquiring or building towards an agency that then allows them to take back control and be able to then perform in the masculinity as they wish. But for the majority, for the large part, their masculinity is continuously and simultaneously performed on structural and social factors and also actors. And finally, the book talks about and posits that citizenship is a performance of whiteness. 100% of my interlocutors had experienced verbal abuse at some point in their migration experience, or married migration experience, I should say. I found 29% experienced physical abuse, 45% experienced psychological abuse, 60% experienced financial abuse, which included taking salaries away from them. And so, borrowing from the Stanford Prison Experiment, where there were two groups, for those of you who may not be aware of Stanford Prison Experiment, a group of prisoners were divided in two camps, into two groups, where one group remained prisoners and the second group were promoted to the role of prison officers. And with that acquired and assumed and newly found power, that was used, or I should say abused, to then subject the group that remained prisoners to torture. And so, using conceptualizations and understanding of the Stanford Prison Experiment, I argue that citizenship operates in the same way within intra-group relations, particularly with migrants, pioneer generation of migrants, and migrants who have are new and incoming into the country. And so I highlight that this is based on and furthers colonial legacies as the traces of colonialism in and through the partition of India still linger on within the community. Because what citizenship and coming to Britain allows and enables is this closeness to the state of Britain, Britain as a state, as a concept and representation of whiteness and white power. And so the longer in which citizenship has been acquired, the greater capital or the greater assumed power it enables individuals to then use to impose others and subjugate newly incoming migrants, is what I found particularly between the relationship between mother and father-in-laws and senior pioneer generation leaders and migrant husbands who've just come into the country. Some quotes from the book that speak to violence and abuse. I've kept sort of the more sort of extreme forms out, just in terms of trigger warnings and stuff. Some quotes here: when I brought the glass of water to my father-in-law, it was red because I had rinsed it before filling it with water. He threw the water in my face and the glass on the floor in front of my other uncles. One of my uncles said, "What are you doing? Don't be so harsh." But my father-in-law told him he needs to know how to serve me properly. He's ungrateful for what I've done for him. As in, give us my daughter and then secured his migration to the UK. My father-in-law threatened he would not make the permanent visa happen, as in the threat of deportation was always lingered quite heavily for these migrant husbands. He said he was going to get me deported, all because I refused to stop talking to my parents because he had an argument with my dad. I was sworn at, called names, and even sat in front of my wife's siblings and sometimes in front of guests. I was made a mockery of, like one of those monkeys they asked to perform at circuses. So these are some of the testimonies or the lived experiences that my husband's shared with me throughout my research, which are really powerful, not only for sort of the concepts that we're talking about in the masculinity and migration and citizenship, but basic human rights and decency and dignity, you know, that everyone should be afforded irrespective of status, background and citizenship. There were different ways in which migrants found to be reasserting their masculinity, and the book also traces this, but this was not always possible. And so sometimes in the intersecting spaces that I talked about earlier, fell sometimes between the villagers and the household. This is a real technique to gain that trust and grow that social cultural capital to enable families and community to trust them. Provide, for example, and not said that British-born Pakistani men don't go to the mosque usually, but the fact that I do, and I'm from Pakistan, means that I'm more valuable to them as in-laws than their own British sons. I give them more honour. I think I would have been respected less and treated worse if I was not religious like this. So there was a sort of social capital that religious identity or religiosity offered some migrant husbands, I should say, not all. And finally, in terms of the current research projects, post the publication of the book, I've been looking at the British Muslim marriage market in particular, for which I conducted some fieldwork last spring and summer 2024, where I found increasingly marriage events happening and being the community or the British Muslim community moving away from these traditional arranged marriages. Another stereotype, I think. People are finding love on TikTok and Instagram, and again, how do we move away from these old age stereotypes that circulate many ethnic communities and brand many ethnic communities, I think. So some of the work has been looking at that, and there's a screenshot at the top which shows them just half of a page, by the way, on Eventbrite, and you can go into Eventbrite and search Muslim marriage events now, and you get a whole list and some archived events, which is really exciting, I think, particularly for these intersection between digital spaces and the social migration of ethnic communities in Britain. I think it's really exciting. Some of my work has also looked at mosque architecture. Project that I'm currently pursuing is minarets at the margins, where I'm looking at mosque architecture and urban Islamophobia in France, Italy, and UK. Representation of remittances and the pound, the capital of pound on social media. So this screenshot here is of TikTok, and I've utilized the digital space of TikTok to look at the representation of remittances online. And this is a video that got over 500,000 views. And it says it's in Kashmir, but it's a lavish mansion built on remittances. But it says UK Palace, which is really interesting. And so this is another aspect, also builds on masculinity, but also mainly the masculinity of pioneer generation of migrants who came here maybe 20 or 30 years ago and were likely to be in a position to build houses like this. So I thought this was really interesting, and the digital spaces are allowing us fresh insights into the social migration of ethnic communities in the UK. And finally, I've been looking at masculinity and the Muslim vote in the UK general election last year. This bottom picture was WhatsApped to a few of me and a few of my friends by the Muslim vote. And all of the candidates were men in Birmingham that the Muslim vote supported and endorsed. Independent candidates that were particularly standing against the Labour Party, branded by the mainstream media as the Gaza vote. But interesting how the intersection of masculinity and democracy and power and grassroots movements in ethnic marginalized communities clashes with structural power and political machinery of political parties. The results of that were really exciting, and I'm telling as racialized geographies of power, which hopefully I'll be publishing the later edition, all goes well. But that's something that I'm also looking at, and how I'm perceiving and conceptualizing masculinity post publication of this book. And that's a wrap. So thank you so much.